Children abandon elderly mother on Christmas night. 15 years later, she returns, and what happens is shocking. What would you do if your entire family betrayed you on Christmas night? For Margaret Wilson, a 65-year-old retired teacher, December 25th wasn't about presents and carols. It was the night she discovered the true price of trust. But sometimes, life's cruelest betrayals can lead to the most unexpected victories. This is a story about Christmas, family, justice, and how 15 years of patience can change everything. Get ready for a journey that will make you question everything you know about family bonds and the power of a mother's love. Margaret Wilson's hands trembled as she stared at her computer screen, the bright Christmas lights from her window reflecting off her reading glasses. Her morning routine of checking emails before preparing Christmas dinner had just turned her world upside down. Mom signed the papers last week. The house is officially sold. She has no idea. Make sure to keep acting normal until after dinner. The email from Thomas to his siblings made her stomach turn. She scrolled up, finding dozens of exchanges between her 3 children, planning every detail of their betrayal. Her mind flashed back to last Tuesday, when Thomas had rushed in during his lunch break. "Just some routine paperwork for your accounts, Mom," he'd said, pointing to where she needed to sign. She trusted him completely. After all, he'd been managing her finances since their father died 5 years ago. The timer on her oven beeped, snapping her back to reality. The turkey needed basting. Margaret stood up slowly, her legs weak. Walking to the kitchen of her Victorian home in Burlington, Vermont, memories flooded her mind with each step. This kitchen had seen 40 Christmas celebrations. Right there, by the counter, was where little Tommy had dropped the glass angel while trying to steal cookies. Sarah had learned to make her first pie at that very spot. And Benjamin, sweet Benjamin, would always sneak extra marshmallows into the sweet potato casserole when he thought no one was looking. She opened the oven, the blast of heat bringing tears to her eyes. Or maybe it wasn't just the heat. The turkey was perfectly golden, just like every year. Her special stuffing, the recipe passed down from her mother, filled the house with its familiar aroma. On the counter, Sarah's favorite scalloped potatoes waited their turn in the oven, while Benjamin's beloved apple pie cooled by the window. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed noon. Her children would arrive in just 4 hours. Margaret's hands shook as she picked up her phone, tempted to confront them immediately. But years of teaching elementary school had taught her patience. She needed to understand their full plan. Moving to her dining room, she smoothed the hand-embroidered tablecloth her grandmother had made. The delicate holly pattern around the edges had taken months to complete, a labor of love passed down through generations. Just like this house. Just like everything she tried to give her children. The Christmas tree in the corner sparkled with 40 years of collected ornaments. Each one told a story. The little silver rattle from Thomas's first Christmas, the ballet slippers from Sarah's dance recital years, the tiny baseball mitt from Benjamin's Little League championships. How could they plan to take all this away? To sell these memories to strangers? Margaret sat heavily in her usual chair, remembering last Christmas. Everything had seemed normal then, but had they been planning this even then? Had they looked at her beloved home and seen only dollar signs? The doorbell rang, making her jump. Through the frosted glass, she could see Eleanor, her neighbor, holding a Christmas card. Margaret quickly wiped her eyes and plastered on a smile. She couldn't let anyone know. Not yet. Not until she understood exactly what her children had planned. "Margaret, Merry Christmas!" Eleanor's cheerful voice carried the familiar warmth of their 15-year friendship. "I thought I'd drop this off before my daughter picks me up for dinner." "Thank you, Eleanor. Would you like to come in for a moment?" Margaret heard her own voice, steady despite everything. Years of teaching had taught her to keep composure even when her world was crumbling. "Oh, I wish I could, but Jenny's already on her way. But I'll see you at the community center's New Year celebration, right?" Margaret nodded, managing another smile. Would she even still be in this house by New Year's? The thought made her dizzy. Back in the kitchen, she mechanically continued her preparations. The silver needed polishing. The crystal glasses waited to be filled. The Christmas china her husband had surprised her with on their 25th anniversary needed to be set out. Her husband. What would Richard say if he could see what their children were planning? The man who'd worked 60-hour weeks to pay for this house, who'd insisted on setting up trust funds for each child's education, who'd believed so completely in their children's goodness. The sound of a car door slamming outside made her heart race. But it was just the neighbors leaving for their own Christmas celebrations. 4 more hours. In 4 hours, she would face her children across the table they'd gathered around for every Christmas of their lives. The table where they now planned to destroy hers. Margaret straightened her shoulders and checked her reflection in the window. She saw a woman who'd dedicated her life to family, to creating a home filled with love and tradition. And she saw something else too, a strength she didn't know she had. Whatever was coming, she would face it with dignity. She had to know just how far her children would go. The doorbell rang at exactly 4 o'clock. Margaret took a deep breath and opened the door to find Thomas, his wife Patricia, and their 2 teenagers standing on the porch with wrapped presents. "Merry Christmas, Mom." Thomas stepped forward to hug her. Margaret forced herself to hug back, remembering the emails she'd read that morning. His expensive cologne couldn't mask the smell of deception. Sarah arrived next with her husband and 3 children, followed shortly by Benjamin and his wife. Soon the house was filled with the noise of grandchildren and the rustling of gift-wrapping paper. "Something smells amazing, Mom," Sarah said, walking into the kitchen. "Need any help?" Margaret shook her head, watching her daughter check her phone for the 5th time in 10 minutes. Was she texting about the house sale? About their plans for after dinner? "Let's eat before everything gets cold," Margaret announced, carrying the turkey to the dining room. She'd made this walk countless times, but tonight felt different. Last Christmas, Richard had still been alive, sitting at the head of the table, carving the turkey with practiced precision. "I'll do the honors," Thomas offered, taking the carving knife. Margaret watched him slice through the meat, remembering how different his father's hands had looked performing the same task. Strong, honest hands that had never betrayed anyone. The meal began normally enough. The grandchildren chatted about their Christmas lists, the adults discussed work and weather. But Margaret noticed the subtle glances between her children, the way Thomas kept checking his watch, how Sarah's smile seemed plastered on. "Remember last Christmas?" Benjamin asked suddenly. Dad insisted on telling that awful joke about the turkey crossing the road. Margaret's hand tightened around her fork. "Your father loved this holiday," she said quietly. "He worked so hard to give us this home, this family." Thomas cleared his throat. "Speaking of home, Mom, we need to talk about something important." The room fell silent. Even the grandchildren sensed the shift in atmosphere. "Kids, why don't you go play in the living room?" Sarah suggested. The younger generation quickly scattered, leaving the adults alone with their tension. "Mom," Thomas began, using his lawyer voice, "we've been worried about you living alone in this big house. It's too much maintenance, too many stairs, too many responsibilities." Margaret set down her fork. "I manage just fine." "But you shouldn't have to manage," Sarah jumped in. "We found a wonderful retirement community in Florida. Beautiful grounds, activities, people your age." "My age?" Margaret's voice was steady. "I'm 65, not 95. I taught 4th grade until last year." "It's not about age, Mom," Benjamin added softly. "It's about quality of life." "The house has already been sold," Thomas said flatly. "We got an excellent price. The money will ensure you're taken care of for the rest of your life." The words hung in the air like poison. Margaret looked at each of their faces, these strangers wearing her children's features. "You sold my house?" she asked, though she'd known since morning. Hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way the emails hadn't. "We've arranged a temporary apartment until the Florida place is ready," Sarah explained. "The new owners want to take possession before New Year's." "New Year's?" Margaret's voice cracked. "In 6 days? Your things are being packed tomorrow," Thomas continued. "We've hired professionals. They'll handle everything." Margaret stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Everything? Like my memories? My life? Your father's life?" "Mom, please understand," Benjamin pleaded. "We're doing this for you, for me." Margaret laughed, a hollow sound. Tell me, when you signed the papers to sell this house, my house, did you think about the Christmas mornings we spent here? The birthdays? The graduations? Did you think about your father building that tree house in the backyard? Or teaching you to ride bikes in the driveway? Those are just memories, Mom, Sarah said. You can take those with you. Just memories? Margaret's voice grew stronger. This house is your father's legacy. He spent 30 years paying for it, making it a home. And you sold it without even telling me? The market is perfect right now, Thomas explained. We got over asking price, the investment potential. Investment potential? Margaret interrupted. Is that what family means to you now? Investment potential? She looked around the table, at the Christmas china that would be packed away tomorrow, at the family photos on the walls that would be taken down, at the faces of the children she'd raised, who now looked at her with calculated concern. The movers will be here at 9, Thomas said firmly. We've already packed a suitcase for you. Everything else will be handled. Margaret stood straighter, channeling 40 years of classroom authority. And if I refuse? Mom, Sarah sighed, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Harder? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. Then selling my home without my knowledge? Then planning to ship me off to Florida, like excess baggage? She looked at each of them one last time, these strangers at her Christmas table. Then she turned and walked to the kitchen, leaving them with their cold turkey and colder hearts. Margaret stood in her kitchen, listening to the whispered arguments coming from the dining room. The Christmas lights outside cast moving shadows through the window. She checked the time, 7:30 p.m. on Christmas Day. In less than 14 hours, the movers would arrive. Mom? Benjamin appeared in the doorway. Let me drive you to the apartment. It's getting late. I need to pack some things, she said. We've handled that, he replied. There's a suitcase ready in my car. Margaret turned to face him. You packed for me? When? Benjamin shifted uncomfortably. Last week. Sarah picked out everything you'd need for the first few days. The realization hit her hard. Last week? So when you came over for coffee on Tuesday? I was checking what you'd need, he admitted. Mom, please don't make this difficult. Difficult? She opened a kitchen drawer and pulled out a stack of papers. Like these bank statements I found? The ones showing my accounts were emptied last month? Benjamin paled. Thomas said that was temporary, for the Florida deposit. Did he also say he's been transferring my pension payments to a new account since your father died? She watched his face. You didn't know that part, did you? Before Benjamin could respond, Thomas walked in. Mom, it's time to go. The apartment is all set up. All set up? Margaret laughed. Like how you set up my finances? Everything I did was legal, Thomas snapped. You signed the papers. Papers you said were routine account maintenance. Margaret's voice was steel. Papers you brought while I was making your favorite Christmas cookies. Sarah appeared behind them. The kids are tired. Can we wrap this up? Margaret looked at her only daughter. Wrap this up? Like you wrapped up the sale of my house? Blam. No. Margaret cut her off. I want to know how long. How long have you been planning this? The siblings exchanged glances. Finally, Benjamin spoke. Since Dad died. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. 5 years. They'd been planning this for 5 years. The apartment is furnished, Thomas said briskly. The movers will bring your personal items once they're sorted. Sorted? Margaret opened another drawer, pulling out a real estate contract. Like how you sorted out this sale, without telling me the price, without showing me any offers? The market. Don't talk to me about the market, she interrupted. Talk to me about why my children are throwing me out of my home on Christmas night. No one answered. Outside, carol singers could be heard in the distance. Fine. Margaret grabbed her purse. Let's see this apartment. The drive was silent. Thomas led, with Margaret in Benjamin's car, and Sarah following. They pulled up to a small apartment complex on the other side of town. 3rd floor, Thomas announced, leading them up. No elevator. The apartment door opened to reveal a single room with a kitchenette. A twin bed sat in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs in another. The walls were bare. Your things will brighten it up, Sarah said quickly. Margaret walked to the window. The view was of the parking lot. The suitcase has everything you need, Thomas said, checking his phone. We should go. It's getting late. Everything I need, Margaret turned. Like my husband's pictures, my grandchildren's artwork, the quilt my mother made. The movers will bring. The movers will bring whatever you decide to let me keep, she finished, just like you decided everything else. One by one, her children made excuses to leave. Benjamin lingered at the door. I'll call tomorrow, he promised. Will you? Margaret asked. Or will you wait until the house is empty and my life is packed away in boxes? The door closed behind him. Margaret listened to their footsteps descending the stairs. Cars started. Engines faded. She sat on the small bed, her purse still clutched in her hands. The Christmas carol singers were far away now, their voices just a memory, like her home, her life, her family. The clock on her phone showed 8:45 p.m. Christmas Day was almost over. In the morning, strangers would pack up 40 years of her life. Her children would supervise, deciding what she could keep, what she deserved to remember. Silent Night played faintly from someone else's apartment. Margaret lay down on the unfamiliar bed, still in her Christmas dress, and finally let the tears come. 3 days after Christmas, Margaret stood in line at Wilson's pharmacy, clutching her prescription bottle. The same prescription she'd been taking for 5 years, since Richard's death. Her hands trembled as she reached the counter. "Good morning," the pharmacist said. "That'll be $48. Margaret pulled out her credit card, the one Thomas had always managed for her. The card reader beeped red. Declined. "Maybe try again?" the pharmacist suggested kindly. 3 attempts, 3 declines. The line behind her grew longer. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered, her face burning. "I'll have to come back." "Wait." A woman stepped forward from the line. "I'm Eleanor Mitchell. I'll take care of it." Margaret started to protest, but Eleanor was already handing over her card. "I insist," she said. "We can talk about it over coffee." 20 minutes later, they sat in the diner across the street. Margaret stared at her untouched coffee. "I know who you are," Eleanor said quietly. "I recognize the prescription. It's the same one Richard Wilson was taking before he died." Margaret's head snapped up. "You knew my husband?" "I was the pharmacist who filled his prescriptions that last year." Eleanor paused. "And now I'm a lawyer who specializes in elder law." "A career change? After seeing too many seniors being taken advantage of, I went to law school at 55. Eleanor leaned forward. "Mrs. Wilson, why was your card declined?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "My children, they sold my house. Apparently they've been controlling my finances for years." "Show me everything," Eleanor said, pulling out a notepad. Over the next hour, Margaret shared the whole story. The Christmas dinner, the secret sale, the empty bank accounts. Eleanor took detailed notes, her frown deepening. "Your son Thomas," she said finally. "He's with Harrison and Reed Law Firm, correct?" Margaret nodded. "I've seen his name before." Eleanor opened her laptop. Last month, a colleague mentioned some irregularities in estate settlements he'd handled. She typed quickly, then turned the screen. "Look at these dates. All properties sold without proper documentation, all involving elderly parents." Margaret's coffee went cold as Eleanor showed her file after file. Thomas's name appeared on all of them. "This isn't just about your house," Eleanor said gently. "Your son has been doing this systematically. The question is, did your husband know?" "Richard?" Margaret shook her head. "He trusted Thomas completely, put him in charge of everything when he got sick." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "When exactly did Thomas take control of the finances?" "Right after Richard's diagnosis." Margaret paused. "He said Dad asked him to handle everything." "Did you ever see that request in writing?" "No, but—" Margaret stopped. "Thomas said it was all discussed in the hospital. I was so worried about Richard, I just signed whatever Thomas put in front of me." Eleanor pulled out her phone, dialing quickly. "Judge Harrison, Eleanor Mitchell. Remember that pattern we discussed? I found another case, but this one's different. It started 5 years ago with Richard Wilson's estate." She listened for a moment. "Yes, that Wilson, his son Thomas." Another pause. "I understand. We'll be there at 2. Eleanor hung up and looked at Margaret. "Judge Harrison handled your husband's estate. He's been investigating similar cases. He wants to see us immediately." "But why?" "Because your husband was a respected businessman who kept meticulous records. If Thomas started his scheme with your family's estate—" "Scheme?" "Margaret," Eleanor said softly, "I don't think your children decided to sell your house at Christmas. I think this was planned years ago, starting with your husband's estate, and I think there are other families involved. Margaret felt the room spin. Other families? At least 7 cases in the last 3 years, all following the same pattern. Elderly parents, houses sold without consent, children suddenly in control of all assets. Eleanor gathered her things. But your case might be the key to everything. Because if Thomas falsified documents while your husband was alive, that's not possible, Margaret protested. Richard would have known. Would he? Eleanor asked. If he was sick, taking strong medication, trusting his son to handle everything. Margaret remembered those final months. Richard, confused from the medications, signing papers Thomas brought to the hospital. She thought nothing of it then. Now? The judge is waiting, Eleanor said, standing. Are you ready to find out what really happened 5 years ago? Margaret rose shakily. Do I have a choice? You always have a choice, Eleanor replied. That's what your children forgot, and that's what we're going to remind them of. They walked out into the cold December afternoon, heading toward answers that would change everything. Again, the community center's piano needed tuning, but Margaret's fingers still found the right notes. 2 weeks had passed since the meeting with Judge Harrison, and she'd thrown herself into volunteer work to keep her mind occupied. That's beautiful, said Linda, the center's director. We haven't had anyone play in months. Margaret smiled, continuing the melody. A few seniors stopped their card games to listen. Did you teach? Linda asked. For 40 years, 4th grade. Margaret's fingers moved automatically through the familiar tune. Music was always part of my classroom. We're looking for someone to start a music program here, Linda mentioned. Nothing fancy, just twice a week. Margaret hit a wrong note. Teaching again? At her age? I'll think about it, she said. That evening, in her small apartment, Margaret called Eleanor. The judge is still reviewing the documents, Eleanor said. These things take time. Meanwhile, how are you holding up? The community center offered me a teaching position, Margaret replied. A music program. Take it, Eleanor said firmly. You need something to focus on besides the case. The next day, Margaret posted sign-up sheets for piano lessons. By afternoon, she had 5 students, including 8-year-old Emily Parker. My grandpa's a judge, Emily mentioned during her first lesson. He says music keeps his mind sharp. Margaret's hands froze over the keys. Your grandfather is Judge Harrison? Emily nodded. He said you might be teaching here. That's why he told Mom about the lessons. Over the next few weeks, Margaret's student list grew. She taught seniors in the mornings, children in the afternoons. The old, upright piano became her anchor. One morning, she arrived to find a new piano in the activity room. Anonymous donation, Linda winked, though Judge Harrison might have mentioned our need to some influential people. Margaret's program flourished. Children who struggled in school found confidence in music. Seniors rediscovered old skills. The community center buzzed with new energy. Then came the day Emily brought a photo to her lesson. Grandpa found this in his office, she said. He said to show you. The photo showed Richard, Margaret's husband, at what looked like a charity event. Next to him stood Thomas, talking to a group of elderly couples. Grandpa says these people lost their houses too, Emily said innocently. Margaret's throat tightened. When was this taken? The year before your husband died. Eleanor's voice came from behind. She'd been waiting in the doorway. All 4 couples in that photo lost their homes to their children within 2 years. Emily looked confused. Time for a break, Margaret said quickly. Why don't you practice the new piece? As Emily played, Margaret and Eleanor moved to the corner. Judge Harrison found more, Eleanor whispered. Thomas approached these couples at charity events, always ones Richard attended. He used his father's reputation, Margaret realized, to gain trust, to find victims. Eleanor's voice was hard. The judge is building a case, but we need more evidence. The other couples? Too afraid to speak up, their children threatened to cut off all contact. Margaret watched Emily play, her small fingers careful on each key. What do you need me to do? Keep teaching, Eleanor said. The judge's granddaughter taking lessons here, it gives him a reason to visit, to watch. Thomas won't suspect a thing. And Sarah and Benjamin? Sarah's spa business is struggling. Benjamin's been asking questions about the family finances. Eleanor smiled grimly. The cracks are showing. Margaret turned back to the piano where Emily was finishing her piece. "Beautiful," she said, sitting down beside her student. "Now, let's try something new." As she guided Emily's hands over the keys, Margaret felt stronger than she had in weeks. Her children had taken her home, her money, her security, but they couldn't take her ability to teach, to touch lives, to rebuild. "Mrs. Wilson," Linda called from the door, "we have 3 more students signing up, and the senior choir wants to know if you'll direct them." Margaret nodded, a plan forming in her mind. Tell them yes to everything. Every new student meant another connection. Every parent, every grandparent, every senior who came to sing. They were all potential witnesses, all people who might have heard something, seen something. "Ready for your next piece?" she asked Emily. The girl nodded eagerly. "Good," Margaret said, selecting the music. "This one's about persistence, about not giving up. Like the judge building his case, like Eleanor gathering evidence, like Margaret herself, turning loss into purpose, one piano key at a time." "You need to see this," Eleanor said, spreading documents across her office desk. It was a cold February morning, 2 months since Christmas. Judge Harrison's team found something in the hospital records. Margaret sat down, her hands shaking. "Richard's records?" "Yes. Look at the medication logs from his last month." Eleanor pointed to a chart. "The doses don't match what was prescribed." "What do you mean?" "Someone was adjusting his medication, making him more confused than he needed to be." Eleanor's voice hardened, specifically on days when financial documents were signed. Margaret felt sick. "Thomas wouldn't." "There's more." Eleanor pulled out another file. "We found the original version of Richard's will. The one filed with the court is different." She laid both documents side by side. Margaret stared at her husband's signatures. One clear and strong, one shaky and uncertain. "The dates," Margaret whispered. "The second one was signed 3 days before he died. When he was heavily medicated." Eleanor nodded. "But look at the witness signatures." Margaret gasped. The same names appeared on both documents, but with different handwriting. "Forgery," Eleanor said quietly. "And not just on the will. We found at least 12 other documents with forged signatures. Property transfers, power of attorney, bank access forms. How did no one notice? They did. A nurse filed a report about the medication discrepancies." Eleanor's face darkened. The report disappeared. She was transferred to another hospital the next week. Margaret stood up, pacing the office. "What about Sarah and Benjamin? Did they know?" "We're not sure yet, but this morning we found something else." Eleanor hesitated. "A letter from Richard to Judge Harrison." She handed Margaret a sealed envelope. The handwriting was unmistakably Richard's, clear, strong, from before his illness. "He knew," Eleanor said softly. "He suspected something was wrong. He wrote this letter 2 weeks before his hospitalization." Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. "Dear James," she read aloud. "If you're reading this, my suspicions were correct. Thomas has been asking strange questions about our family trust. Documents have gone missing from my office. Last week, I caught him practicing my signature." She had to stop, her vision blurring. "Keep reading," Eleanor urged. "I've set up a separate account that only Margaret can access. Thomas doesn't know about it. The access codes are in the envelope. If anything happens to me, make sure Margaret gets this information. And James, protect her from what's coming. I think this goes deeper than just our family." Margaret looked up. "There's no account information in here." "No," Eleanor agreed, "but there is this." She pulled out a key, found in Judge Harrison's old files. It belongs to a safety deposit box. Richard never mentioned a safety deposit box, because it's not in his name or yours. Eleanor smiled. "It's in the name of your first dog, Buddy Wilson." The judge remembered Richard mentioning it once, said it was an inside joke between them. Margaret sat down hard. "Buddy, Richard's childhood dog, he always said," her voice caught. "He always said Buddy was the most loyal friend he ever had." "The bank's still open," Eleanor said, checking her watch. "Want to see what Richard left for you?" 20 minutes later, they stood in the bank vault. The safety deposit box contained a USB drive, more letters, and a thick folder of documents. "Evidence," Eleanor breathed, scanning the papers. "Bank transfers, fake documents, a list of potential targets." Richard was building a case. "Against his own son," Margaret whispered. "Not just Thomas." "Look," Eleanor pointed to names in the documents. Other lawyers, bank officials, even a judge. This is a whole network. What do we do with this? Eleanor's phone buzzed. A text from Judge Harrison. She read it and looked up grimly. Thomas just filed papers to have you declared mentally incompetent. He's trying to gain full guardianship. Margaret straightened her spine. Can he do that? He can try. Eleanor gathered the documents. But first, he'll have to explain these to the court. She paused. Margaret, you understand what this means? If we use these documents, your son could go to prison. Margaret looked at Richard's letters, thinking of the man who'd loved his family so much he'd protected them even after death. My husband died trying to expose this, she said firmly. I won't let that be for nothing. It could get ugly. The media, the courts, your family, they stopped being my family on Christmas Day. Margaret picked up the USB drive. What's our next step? Eleanor's eyes gleamed. We take this to Judge Harrison, then we let Thomas try his competency hearing. Let him walk right into his own trap. And Sarah and Benjamin, if they were involved, we'll find out. Eleanor checked her watch. The judge can see us in an hour. Are you ready for this? Margaret thought of her students at the community center, of the other families who'd lost their homes, of Richard fighting alone in his final days. Yes, she said. I'm ready. The next 15 years passed like chapters in a book Margaret never expected to write. 2006. The competency hearing never happened. When Thomas received notice that Judge Harrison would preside, he withdrew the petition. Margaret's music program at the community center grew to 50 students. 2007, Sarah's spa business expanded to 3 locations. She appeared in local magazines talking about family values and caring for aging parents. Margaret kept every article, adding them to the evidence file. 2008, Benjamin tried to contact Margaret through Eleanor. I want to make things right, he said. Eleanor's response was simple. Start by telling the truth. He never called back. 2009, the community center named Margaret their director of arts programs. Her choir performed at city events. Local newspapers covered their concerts. Thomas avoided any event where she might appear. 2010, Emily Judge Harrison's granddaughter won a state piano competition. In her speech, she thanked Mrs. Wilson, who taught me that music is about truth. Sarah's oldest daughter was in the audience. She cried through the entire performance. 2011, Thomas's law firm made him senior partner. The announcement mentioned his dedication to elder care law. That same week, 3 more families contacted Judge Harrison about missing assets. 2012, Margaret moved to a better apartment, paid for by her teaching income. From her window, she could see her old house. The new owners had painted it blue. Richard had always wanted a blue house. 2013, Sarah's spas started struggling. Health department investigations, tax audits, anonymous complaints. Eleanor smiled when Margaret asked about it. 2014, Benjamin's wife filed for divorce. In the proceedings, she mentioned ethical concerns about family business dealings. The divorce records were sealed, but Judge Harrison received copies. 2015, Margaret's music program received state recognition. The mayor attended the ceremony. Thomas's daughter played hooky from school to watch from the back row. She left before Margaret could reach her. 2016, Sarah tried to sell her failing spas. No buyers. The same bank that had approved her initial loans now refused to help. The bank's new compliance officer was a former student of Eleanor's. 2017, Thomas's law firm opened an investigation into his cases. Client complaints, missing documents, irregular transactions. He blamed clerical errors. The State Bar Association requested interviews. 2018, Benjamin started drinking. His business partners bought him out. At a restaurant, Margaret overheard him tell the bartender, I should have stood up to them 15 years ago. 2019, Sarah's last spa closed. She listed her house for sale. Her children stopped speaking to her when they learned she'd planned to use their college funds to save the business. 2020, Margaret's program had 200 students. The community center built a proper music wing with practice rooms and a performance space. They named it the Wilson Music Center. Through it all, Eleanor and Judge Harrison built their case. Piece by piece, document by document, witness by witness. 15 years, Eleanor said one day. Most people would have given up. Margaret looked around her office at the community center. Photos covered the walls, students, performances, award ceremonies. I didn't give up. I grew stronger. Thomas is about to be named managing partner, Eleanor mentioned. The announcement dinner is this Christmas Eve at Le Petit Chateau. The most expensive restaurant in town, Margaret nodded, where they can show off their success. Sarah and Benjamin will be there, all their children. Eleanor paused. It's time, Margaret. After 15 years, the judge has everything we need. The State Bar Association is ready. The FBI has the financial records. Eleanor laid a file on Margaret's desk. One signature from you, and it all starts. Margaret picked up a framed photo from her desk, her first community center recital. She'd been so broken then, so lost. Now, Richard tried to protect me, she said quietly. He died trying to expose the truth. And now you can finish what he started. Margaret looked at her calendar. December 1st, 2020. 20 days until Christmas Eve. 20 days until she faced her children again. Will you be there? She asked Eleanor. Right beside you. Eleanor smiled. We all will be. The judge, the investigators, everyone who's been waiting for this moment. Margaret signed the document. Her hand didn't shake. 15 years, she said. They thought they broke me that Christmas. They didn't realize they set me free. Eleanor took the signed paper. Outside, Margaret's students were arriving for afternoon lessons. Life moving forward as it had for 15 years. Shall I make the dinner reservation? Eleanor asked. Margaret nodded. Table for two, where we can see everything. Le Petit Chateau glowed with Christmas lights on December 24th, 2020. Through the window, Margaret watched Thomas hold court at the center table, raising a toast to his new position as managing partner. Sarah sat to his right, Benjamin to his left, their children scattered around the table. Ready? Eleanor asked, checking her watch. Wait. Margaret studied the scene. Thomas's wife laughed too loudly at his jokes. Sarah kept glancing at her phone. Benjamin's hands shook as he lifted his wine glass. Look at them. They have no idea. The FBI agents are in place? Eleanor said quietly. Judge Harrison is at the bar. Everything's ready. Margaret straightened her jacket. Then it's time. They walked through the restaurant's front door at exactly 8 p.m. The matron nodded. He'd been briefed. As they approached the central area, conversations quieted. Heads turned. Thomas saw her first. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the table. Sarah's phone clattered to the floor. Benjamin turned white. For a moment, time stopped. 15 years dissolved. Margaret saw them as they were that Christmas night, cruel, confident, certain of their victory. But now she saw something else in their eyes. Fear. Mom? Thomas found his voice first. What are you? Hello, Thomas. Margaret's voice carried in the silence. Congratulations on making managing partner. He started to stand. A man at the bar, an FBI agent, shifted slightly. Thomas sat back down. Mrs. Wilson? Eleanor stepped forward. Would you like to sit? No need. Margaret smiled. This won't take long. Sarah tried to speak. Mom, if this is about December 25th, 2005, Margaret cut in. The night you sold my house and abandoned me in an empty apartment. The other diners were openly staring now. Phones appeared, recording. That was a family matter, Thomas said sharply. Family? Margaret laughed. Like the Stewart family? The Hendersons? The Patels? All those other families whose elderly parents mysteriously lost their homes? Thomas's face drained of color. Behind him, Judge Harrison moved closer. I don't know what you're talking about. Thomas stammered. Your father did. Margaret pulled out Richard's letter. He knew what you were planning. He left evidence. Dad was confused, Sarah interrupted. The medication you adjusted? Eleanor stepped forward. We have the hospital records, Sarah. The nurse's report. Everything. Benjamin stood suddenly. I tried to tell them, he blurted. Mom, I wanted to stop it, but Thomas said, shut up. Thomas hissed. No. Benjamin's voice rose. I'm done lying. You forged Dad's signature. You changed his will. You were stealing from him before he even died. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Every phone was recording now. Your father knew, Margaret said quietly. He protected me the only way he could. And now, 15 years later, justice is finally here. As if on cue, FBI agents moved in from every corner. Judge Harrison approached the table. Thomas Wilson? An agent stepped forward. We have a warrant for your arrest on multiple charges of fraud, forgery, and financial exploitation. "This is ridiculous," Thomas sputtered. "I'm a managing partner." "Not anymore." Eleanor held up a document. "The State Bar Association suspended your license this morning. Your firm has already been notified." Sarah tried to grab her purse and run. 2 agents blocked her path. "Sit down, Mrs. Collins," Judge Harrison said. "You're not going anywhere." Benjamin put his head in his hands. His teenage children watched in horror as their father began to sob. "Mom," Sarah pleaded, "we can explain." "Save it for the court." Margaret's voice was steel. "Where you'll explain everything. The forged documents, the stolen money, the drugging of your father." Thomas lunged forward suddenly. FBI agents grabbed him as he tried to reach Margaret. "You ruined everything," he shouted. "We had it all planned. Years of planning." His words echoed through the silent restaurant. Dozens of phones captured every moment. "Yes," Margaret said calmly. "You planned it perfectly. Except for one thing." "What?" Thomas spat. "You thought breaking my heart would break my spirit." She looked at each of her children in turn. "It set me free." She turned to leave, then paused. "Merry Christmas," she said softly. "I'm sure the prison visiting hours are better than that apartment you left me in." As she walked out with Eleanor, Margaret heard the FBI agents reading rights, Sarah's sobs, Benjamin's confessions. But she didn't look back. Outside, snow was falling, just like that Christmas 15 years ago. "Are you okay?" Eleanor asked. Margaret watched the police cars arrive, their lights painting the snow red and blue. "I am now," she said. "I finally am." The morning after Christmas, Margaret's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Videos of last night's arrest had gone viral. Local news vans parked outside the community center, waiting for comments. "Channel 7 is running the story every hour," Eleanor said, closing the office blinds. "They're calling it the Christmas Justice Case." Margaret watched from the window as Thomas's daughter Amanda pushed through reporters to reach the center's door. Security let her in. "Grandma?" Amanda stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. "Is it true? About Dad and the other families?" Margaret gestured to a chair. At 25, Amanda looked so much like Thomas had before greed changed him. "Sit down," Margaret said. "You deserve the truth." Eleanor handed Amanda the case files. 17 families total. Your father targeted elderly parents with valuable properties. Sarah managed the money laundering through her spas. Benjamin helped with the property transfers. Amanda's hands shook as she read. The hospital records, they deliberately confused Grandpa with extra medication? To make him sign documents, Margaret nodded. They needed his signature on the new will. Dad's firm is holding an emergency meeting, Amanda said. All his cases are under review. Clients are pulling out. She looked up. I work there too, in the legal aid department. You help poor families, Margaret said softly. I know, I've been watching all of you. Amanda's phone buzzed. A news alert. She read it and went pale. The State Bar Association. They're investigating everyone who worked with Dad. Her voice cracked. I'll lose my license. Everything I worked for. No, Eleanor interrupted. You won't. She pulled out a document. We submitted evidence clearing you months ago. Judge Harrison made sure of it. Amanda stared at them. You protected me? Why? Because you're not your father, Margaret said. I've seen your pro bono cases, helping elderly clients fight financial abuse. You were fighting against exactly what your father was doing. The office door opened. Sarah's oldest son Michael stood there, still in his medical residence scrubs. I came as soon as my shift ended, he said. Mom's being charged with financial crimes. The hospital board is reviewing my residency. Already handled, Eleanor said, showing another document. Your grandmother made sure you were protected too. Michael collapsed into a chair. The other residents are talking about Mom's spas, how she used them to hide money, patient funds, insurance payments. Your mother made her choices, Margaret said firmly. Just like you made yours, becoming a doctor to help people. More footsteps in the hallway. Benjamin's children arrived next. Lisa and David, college students carrying newspapers. Dad confessed everything, Lisa said. He's cooperating with the FBI. The college called. David added, they're worried about our scholarships with Dad's crime in the news. Margaret opened her desk drawer. Already taken care of. Your scholarships are secure. She looked at all her grandchildren. I've spent 15 years making sure you'd be protected when this day came. Why didn't you tell us? Amanda asked. All these years. You needed to become your own people, Margaret explained, without the weight of knowing what was coming. Eleanor's phone buzzed. Sarah's trying to access offshore accounts. The FBI froze everything. The spas? Michael asked. Being investigated for money laundering. Eleanor confirmed. Every client payment, every transaction. Thomas's firm voted this morning, Amanda added. He's out. They're changing the company name. Margaret watched her grandchildren, the doctor, the public defender, the college students. None of them had known about their parents' crimes. All of them had chosen to help others. What happens now? Lisa asked. Your parents face criminal charges, Eleanor explained. The evidence is overwhelming. Benjamin's cooperation might reduce his sentence, but Thomas and Sarah, they'll go to prison, Amanda finished, and will be known as their children. No, Margaret stood. You'll be known for who you are. Michael, healing people. Amanda, defending the helpless. Lisa and David, studying to make the world better. She looked at each of them. Your parents tried to steal my legacy. Instead, you became it. Every good thing you do erases a bit of their shame. Outside, reporters still waited. But in that office, surrounded by her grandchildren, Margaret finally felt the weight of 15 years lifting. We should make a statement, Eleanor suggested. The press won't leave until they get something. Together, Amanda said suddenly. We'll face them together, show everyone that we stand with Grandma. Margaret looked at her grandchildren, strong, ethical, everything their parents had failed to be. Together, she agreed. It's time to show the world what family really means. The federal courthouse buzzed with activity on a cold January morning. Margaret sat in the front row, Eleanor beside her, as Benjamin took the witness stand. State your name for the record, the prosecutor said. Benjamin Wilson. His voice shook. He looked older than his 50 years, worn down by guilt. Mr. Wilson, tell us when this scheme began. Benjamin glanced at Thomas and Sarah, sitting with their lawyers. Thomas glared. Sarah stared at the floor. It started before Dad got sick, Benjamin began. Thomas found out about Dad's properties, not just our house, but rental units, commercial buildings. He wanted them all. How did he plan to get them? First, he became Dad's lawyer. Then he started changing documents, a little at a time, moving properties into new companies he controlled. Benjamin wiped his eyes. When Dad got suspicious, Thomas decided we needed to act faster. What did you do? Thomas got access to Dad's medication. Sarah knew about dosages from her spa's medical staff. They kept him confused, compliant. Benjamin's voice cracked. I knew it was wrong. I should have stopped them. The prosecutor held up a document. Is this the original will? Yes. Dad left everything to Mom with strict instructions about the properties. He wanted them used to help people, low-income housing, community spaces. And this second will? Thomas forged it. He practiced Dad's signature for weeks. Benjamin pointed to his brother. He made Dad sign it while heavily medicated, then backdated it. What happened after your father died? Thomas took control of everything. He told Mom it was temporary, just until she adjusted. Benjamin looked at Margaret. But they'd already sold most of the properties. The money went through Sarah's spas, then offshore. And the other families? Thomas found them through Dad's business contacts. Elderly parents, valuable properties, adult children with financial problems. He offered to help with estate planning, then used the same tactics. The prosecutor approached with more documents. These bank records showed transfers to your account. Yes. Benjamin's shoulders slumped. They paid me to handle the property transfers. I told myself it was just paperwork, but I knew what we were doing to these families. Why did you wait 15 years to confess? Fear, shame. Benjamin looked at his children in the gallery, but mostly because I was a coward. Watching Mom rebuild her life, seeing my kids grow up to be better people than me, I couldn't hide anymore. The prosecutor turned to the jury. No further questions. Thomas's lawyer stood for cross-examination, but Benjamin wasn't finished. There's more, he said, about Dad's death. The courtroom stilled. Thomas found out Dad was gathering evidence. He was going to expose everything. Benjamin's tears flowed freely now. The next day, his medication doses changed. He died 3 days later. Gasps filled the courtroom. Thomas jumped up, his lawyer pulling him back down. Order, the judge commanded. Eleanor squeezed Margaret's hand as Benjamin continued. I have proof. He pulled out an envelope. Dad's private investigator contacted me last year. He had surveillance photos, recorded conversations. I kept them, trying to find the courage to come forward. The judge accepted the envelope. Thomas's face turned gray. "I'm ready to face my punishment," Benjamin said. "But those families deserve to know the truth. Mom deserves to know how Dad tried to protect her." During the recess, Eleanor led Margaret to a private room. "There's something you should know," Eleanor said, "about why I helped you." She opened her briefcase and removed an old photo. "That's Richard," Margaret said, "in law school. But who's the woman with him?" "My sister Jane." Eleanor's voice softened. "She was his first love. They were engaged." Margaret stared at the photo. "She died in a car accident," Eleanor continued. "Richard was devastated, but years later, he found you. He told me you healed his heart." "You knew him all this time?" "I promised him I'd watch over you if anything happened." Eleanor smiled sadly. "When I saw your name in the pharmacy that day, I knew it was time to keep that promise." Margaret touched the photo gently. "He never told me about Jane. He didn't want you to feel like a replacement because you weren't. He said you were his miracle, his second chance at love." Outside, the bailiff called them back to court. Benjamin's testimony had opened the door to murder charges. Thomas faced life in prison. "Ready?" Eleanor asked. Margaret stood, stronger than ever. "Richard never gave up fighting for the truth. Neither will I." They walked back into the courtroom, where justice was finally being served. Not just for Margaret, but for all the families Thomas had destroyed. And somewhere Margaret knew Richard was watching. His final gift to her hadn't been money or property. It had been the truth, and the friend who helped her find it. 6 months after the trial, Benjamin stood at the podium in the Wilson Music Center. The audience, filled with his fellow inmates' families, victims of financial fraud, and community members, listened intently. "My father believed in second chances," he said. "Not the kind my brother offered his victims. False promises and stolen homes. Real second chances, built on truth and redemption." From her seat in the front row, Margaret watched her youngest son. Prison had changed him. The designer suits were gone, replaced by simple prison clothes. But his eyes were clear now, honest. "Today we're launching the Richard Wilson Foundation," Benjamin continued, "using my seized assets and confession money to help elderly victims of financial fraud rebuild their lives." Eleanor, sitting beside Margaret, nodded approvingly. The foundation had been Benjamin's idea, part of his plea deal, but also his path to redemption. "My children taught me about courage," Benjamin gestured to Lisa and David. "While I hid from my crimes, they faced life with honesty. They showed me what I should have been." In the second row, Thomas's daughter Amanda wiped her tears. Her law practice now specialized in elder abuse cases. Next to her, Sarah's son Michael had taken a fellowship in geriatric care. The foundation will provide legal aid, medical care, and housing assistance. Benjamin explained, "Everything we stole from our victims will help restore to others." The press cameras clicked. This was a different kind of story than the scandal that had dominated headlines. This was about healing. After the ceremony, Margaret found Benjamin in their father's old office, now the foundation's headquarters. "Did you mean it?" she asked. "About redemption?" "Every word." Benjamin touched the desk where Richard once worked. "I have 20 years to serve, but each day inside I help other inmates write letters to their families. Real letters, not lies." Margaret sat down. "Your sister refuses to see me." Sarah's pride was always stronger than her conscience. Benjamin sighed. "Thomas still claims he did nothing wrong. And you?" "I wake up every night remembering Dad's face when he realized what Thomas was doing. How I stood by and let it happen." He met her eyes. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." A knock at the door. Amanda entered with Michael and Lisa. "The first cases are ready," Amanda said. 3 families about to lose their homes to fraudulent loans. "Like the Henderson case," Michael added. "I'm reviewing their medical records, signs of medication tampering." Margaret watched her grandchildren, the next generation of Wilsons, rebuilding their family's legacy the right way. "Mom," Benjamin said softly, "I know I can never undo what we did to you, but maybe I can help prevent it from happening to others." "Your father once told me," Margaret replied, "that true strength isn't in never falling, but in how you rise." Eleanor appeared with more files. The FBI found 2 more cases connected to Thomas's old firm. The victims want to speak at his sentencing next week. He's facing life, Benjamin nodded. Sarah took a 20-year plea deal. And you? Lisa asked her father. 20 years, Benjamin smiled sadly. But with purpose now? Running the Foundation's prison outreach program. David opened his laptop. We've already helped 10 families keep their homes. The legal aid network is growing. Margaret stood, looking at the photos on the wall, Richard's original properties, now converted to affordable senior housing. Your father believed in building things that last, she said, not fortunes or empires, communities, families, trust. I destroyed that trust, Benjamin admitted. No, Margaret touched his shoulder. You're rebuilding it, one family at a time. Outside, the community center bustled with activity. Piano music drifted up from the practice rooms. In the courtyard, elderly residents chatted with their volunteer companions, all vetted, all trained to spot signs of abuse. The Foundation's next project, Eleanor announced, spreading blueprints on the desk. A free legal clinic, right here in the center. Dad would have loved that, Benjamin said. He does love it, Margaret corrected. Everything we do here, everything we make right, it's his legacy living on. The grandchildren gathered around the blueprints, planning, suggesting, building. Margaret watched them, the future she never expected, born from the betrayal she never deserved. Benjamin would return to prison that evening, but his work would continue. His redemption would touch lives he'd never meet. Mom, he said as they walked to the transport van, thank you for showing me it's never too late to choose right. Margaret hugged him goodbye. Just keep choosing it. Every day. She watched the van drive away, carrying her youngest son back to pay for his crimes. But this time, she wasn't losing him. This time, she was helping him find his way home. Christmas Eve, 2021. The Wilson Music Center's main hall was packed for its annual holiday concert. Margaret sat in the front row, surrounded by her students, both young and old. The door burst open. Benjamin, escorted by 2 guards, entered with an envelope in his hands. Mom, he called out, rushing forward. You need to see this. The FBI found it in Thomas's offshore accounts. Eleanor appeared beside them, Judge Harrison close behind. What is it? Margaret asked. Dad's final surprise. Benjamin handed her the envelope. Thomas hid this from everyone. Even Sarah didn't know. Margaret opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a banking document and a letter. My dearest Margaret, she read aloud. If you're reading this, our children have betrayed us as I feared they would. But I made preparations they never discovered. She looked up at Eleanor, who nodded encouragingly. The money from our properties, Margaret continued reading, wasn't just transferred to Thomas's accounts. I created a shadow fund, matching every dollar they stole. For 15 years, this money has been growing, managed by trustees they never knew about. Judge Harrison smiled. Richard was always 3 steps ahead. The fund is now worth triple the original amount, Eleanor explained. Thomas found this document last week during prison discovery. He's been screaming about it ever since. Margaret kept reading. This money isn't for revenge, my love. It's for rebuilding. Use it to expand your music program. Help others who've been betrayed by those they trusted. Show our grandchildren that legacy isn't about wealth, it's about impact. Benjamin wiped his eyes. Dad knew. He knew what we would do, and he planned for it. There's more, Eleanor said. The trustees? They're the families Thomas targeted. Richard set it up so that every victim would eventually be part of managing the foundation. The concert hall had gone quiet, everyone listening. Look at the final page, Judge Harrison urged. Margaret turned to it and gasped. It was a deed. Her old house, the one Thomas had sold, had been secretly bought back through Richard's shadow fund. He never let it go, Eleanor explained. The buyers were his trustees. They've been maintaining it, waiting for today. Today? Margaret asked. Read the last line, Benjamin said softly. Margaret returned to the letter. The house isn't meant to be a home again. Transform it into what our community needs, a shelter for elderly victims of abuse, a place where broken trust can heal. Name it after your mother, who taught you about unconditional love. And remember, sometimes the greatest gifts come from our deepest wounds. Amanda and Michael entered, carrying architectural plans. We've been working on this for months, Amanda said, converting the house into a transitional home for seniors recovering from financial abuse. Michael pointed to the designs. Medical facilities on the first floor, legal aid offices in the study, support group spaces in the living room. The garden will be a healing space, Lisa added, joining them. David's already got volunteers from his psychology program. Margaret stared at her old home and the blueprints, reimagined as a sanctuary for others who'd suffered like her. There's one more thing, Eleanor said, the foundation's new name. She unveiled a sign, the Margaret Wilson Center for Elder Justice. No, Margaret said firmly, it should be Richard's name. He insisted it be yours, Judge Harrison said. Read the P.S. Margaret found it at the bottom of the letter. You, my love, showed the world how to rise from betrayal with grace. Your name will remind others that it's never too late for justice, for healing, for love. The concert was beginning. Students filled the stage, children and seniors, all part of Margaret's growing program. Among them were faces she recognized from the shelter planning committee, from legal aid, from support groups. Mom, Benjamin said before the guards led him back. Dad would be proud, not just of this, but of you, how you turned our betrayal into something beautiful. Margaret watched him return to custody, then faced the stage where her students waited. Ready for our concert? Young Emily Harrison asked from the piano. Margaret smiled, taking her place as conductor. Around her, the community she'd built watched with love. Behind her, the plans for a new chapter waited to unfold. Ready, she said, raising her hands. As the music began, she felt Richard's presence, not in the sadness of betrayal, but in the joy of redemption. This was their true legacy, not the one their children tried to steal, but the one they built together that would help others for generations to come. The music soared, carrying hope into the future. Margaret conducted with tears in her eyes, knowing that sometimes love's greatest victories come after its deepest defeats. And in that moment, she was finally completely free. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Did you see the betrayal coming? What would you have done in Margaret's place? Let us know. And if you want more powerful stories of justice, redemption, and the triumph of the human spirit, be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Remember, life's greatest victories often come disguised as our deepest wounds. See you in our next story.